of Rupert Law Group. We handle exclusively E-2 and E-1 visas, so no matter what treaty country you're from or in what state you want to be, we can help. Let's talk a little bit about that, how the officers are kind of trained for the interview process itself. Again, we're talking about E-1s, E-2s, that kind of thing. And just to kind of preface that, worldwide, E-1s and E-2s are pretty rare, particularly E-1s, but E-2s are pretty rare too. I mean, when you go to London, when you go to Toronto, when you go to Paris, Sydney, these things, for sure, they see E-2s. But sometimes you go to a place that's even a treaty country and they just don't have a lot. Helsinki, for example, or oh my gosh, like I don't know. There's going to be other countries out there that I just can't think of right now. But they're just not going to have the volume, right? I sent someone into Bangladesh, and because of reasons of their financial system, there just aren't a lot of applicants. So sometimes they don't know that much about E2. I've actually had weird experiences in Helsinki and Bangladesh about them asking about visas that were not relevant to what we were there for, but that happens, right? Mm-hmm. But aside from, let's talk about just the interview in general, not E-1s and E-2s, but what is the officer thinking? They call the name. Okay, Stephen Smith, come up to the window. What's going through the officer's mind at that point?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, the officers are trained to feel, I shouldn't say feel, but that their job is to look out for U.S. interests, right? So, one of my standard questions always was, how many jobs is the business going to create? Because that's in the U.S. interest to create U.S. jobs, right? So now on this side, I always tell people like that should be up front and center in your business plan, in our cover letter, like that should be something, if it's a good number, right? If it's one employee, that you probably don't want to emphasize that, but if it's a strong number, then you want to emphasize that, because officers are looking at how is this company going to benefit U.S. interest. The other thing, when I was in London, that my colleague next to me routinely always asked was, I'm giving you a 5-year visa. Is this business going to be around in 5 years' time, right? Because, I need to trust that if it isn't, you're going to properly use the visa and come back to the UK, right? So it is first and foremost about, are you going to properly use the visa, and how is this going to benefit the U.S. Then secondarily, yes, if you go to a place that typically, doesn't see a lot of E2 visas, they don't have a specifically trained E2 visa officer, like in the posts that see higher volume, they have an officer that's trained on E2 visas, right? So they're going to know, that the specific requirements, and you're going to have a more in-depth interview on the actual requirements. If you go to a smaller post, yes, you're typically going to get the same, I as an officer had kind of like your typical questions, 5 questions that you ask every single applicant in front of you. And it's hard for an officer to switch gears. Like if they just did, 25 B1, B2 visas before you walked up to the door, you walked up to the window with your E2 application, yes, you're going to get, questions like, how much money do you make? How long have you been at your current job? What are your ties? Because that's, for other visa classes, that's what the officer is used to assessing. So if you get questions that don't seem like they're really relevant to an E2, that's probably likely what is happening, right? And I would say it's okay for you to proactively kind of try to change the, where the interview is headed, and respectfully, sometimes it's not a nice position to be in as an applicant, but sometimes you have to take that opportunity to sort of educate the officer, right? And kind of bring them back to, this is an E2 application, this was my understanding of what, and you don't want to verbally say that, but in a way, redirect the interview to being applicable to an E2. And that's hard to do because you're doing it in 2 to 3 minutes typically, or 5 at the most in most cases, right? So yes, it is a challenge, but if you know that you're going to be going to a smaller post, then and that's part of what Angie and I work with a lot, is preparing applicants for the actual interview, because that's where we want you to be as prepared as possible to encounter those types of questions and circumstances.
If you have any questions about the E2 visa process or the interview, please reach out anytime. We'd love to speak with you about your E2 visa.